Hey everybody, welcome to Bike Guilt. Today we're going to be talking about experience versus exposure on your path to becoming a senior software engineer. Okay, so when people are talking about hiring, when people are talking about getting jobs, when people are talking about their resumes, and when people are talking about what differentiates a junior, mid, or senior level engineer from one another, usually they throw around the term experience. And the problem with this is that experience is only one facet of the large diamond that is creating a senior software engineer, becoming a senior software engineer, discovering what it means to be a senior software engineer. In this series, I'm going to talk a lot about how to become a senior engineer, my definition of a senior engineer. And the first aspect that I'd like to talk about is experience versus exposure. So what is experience? Well, experience is you spending time on a topic to deeply understand it. Experience is about depth. Exposure is about breadth. If you've ever heard or read anything about Valve and how they talk about the type of people that they would like to hire, they talk about T-shaped individuals. So those are individuals that have one or more areas of depth, plus a general breadth of understanding of other concepts and experience in other areas. So this is a very important distinguisher from experience, this concept of exposure to a lot of ideas. Generally, one of the patterns I've noticed in industries that you have engineers that fall into a couple of different categories, and two of those categories, not the only categories, are the loyalist who has spent their entire career at a company or maybe has been at between 1 and 3 companies, and then the perpetual mover who has been at a dozen plus companies. That's who I am. I've been at a ton of companies and done a ton of consulting. We'll talk about the pros and cons another time. But usually, inside of a company, we'll say that the person who's been at the company for 12 years has experience. They have experience in the tech stack the company uses, the history of the company. And this is really important and good. But one issue that arises is they may not have exposure. And that distinguishment is extremely important. So exposure is how many ideas have you seen, have you had experience with, have you seen the pros and cons of? Exposure is crucial because it allows us to weigh different ideas against one another, grounding that measurement in real life experience. And exposure is a huge differentiator between engineers. An experienced engineer may only be experienced in a single avenue of thought. An example of this is they may know one programming language. The problem with this is when presented with a new problem or even an existing problem, they're going to tend to fall back on their experience of that singularity, that mono thought pattern, and apply it to the solution. And when that happens, you don't necessarily get good or optimal outcomes. So a senior engineer ideally has exposure to a lot of thoughts, a lot of problems, and a lot of solutions. That way, when they're going in and seeing something, they can use and leverage that exposure to come up with good solutions. Exposure is what allows us to generate buy-in around decisions that are new, unique, and we've never faced before. And that's important for being a senior engineer. A senior engineer is not just there to write code. They are there to make lasting technical decisions that are good for the health of the team and the product. As such, they have to be able to weigh decisions. Do I build code this way? Do I build code this other way? I have to have had experience doing it in a plurality, in many different ways, so that when it comes time to explain why we're doing it this way, or to take another idea and determine, do we use this idea? Do we not use this idea? You need to have various metrics you can use to measure, various points of experience to use. So it's not that exposure supersedes experience. It's that experience is important, especially when we're talking about depth of knowledge, because part of what defines a senior engineer is their experience in particular technologies so that they are an expert in that technology. I hate using the expert term. A lot of people hate using the expert term. I hate using it because it gives me the heebie-jeebies whenever I say expert, right? You're saying you are all knowing. You're nope. Don't like the expert term. So you're an expert in some specific depths. You have some very particular depths of knowledge. But when you have exposure and experience, you then can weigh those against one another. They are not mutually exclusive, but everybody talks about experience and nobody talks about exposure. I think the reason they don't talk about exposure, in case you're wondering, this is between us, is that exposure generally requires you to change teams. You cannot be on the same team building the same product for a decade and have exposure unless you are going and doing hackathons yourself, working on side projects yourself, consulting outside of work or as part of work, or going and being on loan to other teams. Then you can generate exposure. But generally, for most engineers, exposure means leaving the safety of the thing you have been doing, of the team that is currently paying your salary, and going and finding other places to gain experience at so that you have exposure. So that's it. So that's, again, it boils down to you don't need just one of these things. You need both of these characteristics. You need to have experience. Without experience, it's hard to call yourself a senior engineer. If you can only talk in generalities, if you can't really talk to the metal of a problem, you're not going to have experience, right? That means you don't have experience in that problem or in problems. Then you're not really going to be talking with authority. And if you don't have exposure, meaning that you've seen many problems and you've seen many solutions, then you're also not really going to be an authority when it comes to a problem that you've never faced before, because you're only going to be able to take the mental models established from that one major experience that you have, that technology, that framework, that language, whatever it's going to be, and apply it to the problems you're facing. And the reality is, we want to make sure that our schemas, our psyches, and our experiences, the models we have in our mind that we use to apply to new problems that we've never seen before, are as plastic as possible. They're as wide and breathful as possible, so that when we do encounter situations that we have not been in before, we have a lot of tools that we can leverage so that we may solve the problem. And that's really what it boils down to, right? Experience is knowledge of a tool. Exposure is knowledge of tools. So we want to make sure not just that we are great with a hammer, but we also know how to use a screwdriver, a jigsaw, power drill, lathe, whatever it's going to be. We want to make sure that we have individual knowledge of a tool plus the plurality of tools. All right, that's it. This is going to be a new series that I'm trying to do. I know I'm doing a whole bunch of series, but I'm trying to think about content that might be engaging to you. So I'm going to be talking about what it means to me to be a software engineer, a senior software engineer. And that involves, comparisons of how different companies and people think about senior engineers and the definition of a senior engineer and the characteristics you need to cultivate in order to be a good senior engineer. All right, that's it for the Bike Guild. Thanks for watching.